So, how relevant is the theory of evolution to the human psyche as a whole? In this video, Nick and I are going to explore that. We're going to talk about how the theory of evolution plays into our thinking about the psyche and how the evolutionary principles that we use that guide my work and have done so for years actually help me to understand exactly what's going on with a person, even in the day-to-day level, not just in the abstract. So sit back and enjoy. All right, here we are. Evolutionary approaches to mental health. So this is something that we've been talking about, discussing for a while. It comes up all the time.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental keystone to everything that I think about the psyche, about everything I do. I always go back to what's the evolutionary basis of this. And it's something that drives me completely insane about the psychology and some, corners of psychiatry too. Just in general, over the last 100 years or so, we've made all these great strides, but we're still having a hard time integrating evolution into what we do. And that's a serious problem, I think. And the problem is because we keep pretending like 100 years ago, humans emerged into existence out of nowhere. And it's like Jung complained about this too. He'd said that, we like to pretend like the psyche is completely self-invented in each individual person, from birth. And it just does not work that way. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. And if we keep forgetting about evolution, then we're never going to know what in the heck is really going on. And we're going to always apply incorrect explanations for behaviors, Yeah. But I wanted to, before I start going on a rant about this, your thoughts, your take on it.
We've talked about it a lot. I think for me on my journey through, psychotherapy and counseling and academia and really all of it, I resonate with what you're saying, because I think there's, on one side, there's like this overindulgence into certain kind of physicalist ontologies and philosophies that are at the bedrock of certain ideas about either psychiatry or psychology. And then there's these kind of a lot of ideas about how we should treat people based off of, there's no solid ground, right, to really work from. And three and a half years ago, being introduced to your work really kind of bridged the gap for me in terms of just neurobiology of the gods. Like, oh no, there is a biological evolutionary foundation to this, and that component, I mean, really for me, just gave me a solid foundation in my work and where I want to go with it. So yeah, what you're saying completely resonates with me, and the idea that there needs to be a ground in which we're functioning as clinicians, right? And me as a future clinician, I hear it all the time. It's like, these very abstract ideas, existential philosophies and psychotherapy, so on and so forth. I'm like, where are you coming from?
How does this connect to anything else, like anywhere?
Yeah, at all? Exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly.
How does this connect to what we know about biology, what we know about neuroscience, what we know about all this? And unfortunately, psychiatry has gotten very into the neuroscience aspect, as it makes perfect sense that it should. But we're still not looking at it from the point of view of evolution. We're looking at it from the point of view of a brain just pops up and let's figure out how it works. And everything is due to some sort of chemical imbalance in the brain, right? There's that whole thing. And I hate that too.
Oh yeah.
But maybe it'll help to kind of go, let's take an example of of a mental illness, depression, right? Everybody knows about depression. What are all the different millions of explanations that are out there for this? And you could go with, okay, well, what happened in your childhood, right? Let's explore that, right? That's kind of standard, bog standard depth psychology approach. That you're depressed because of something that happened to you in the past. That's the underlying assumption there. Or the psychopharm angle, right? Okay, you're depressed because your serotonin transmitters are not working properly and you need more or less or whatever it is. Okay, so that's the kind of neurobiological explanation. There's all these different, like tiny slices of an explanation for why you are depressed. But if we don't think about evolution, right? If we don't understand, like, what kind of a species are we talking about here? Okay, what animal? Oh, Homo sapiens. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, we don't know anything about Homo sapiens, do we? Well, actually, yeah, we do. We know where they come from. We know what kind of animal they are. They, blah, 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 right? They're mammals, they're chordates, they're primates, blah, 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 blah. All this stuff. Well, why are we using that information, right? Isn't any of that relevant to what we're doing? Oh, no. Everything's cultural, right? So we looked at that, right? So then there's that. So all of these are reductions. There, I'm going to reduce everything to your personal psychological history in the first case, your neurotransmitters in the second case, to a cultural phenomenon in the third case. And maybe it's because the real answer to this is just so complicated that we just throw our hands up in despair and say, well, I'm just going to latch onto this one thing. It's just that. And that's easier. Okay, but I'm sorry, that's lazy. It's not that's not where we're going to get anywhere. What I really like about the evolutionary approach is it starts, like you say, at the foundation. It says, I'm looking at the behavior of an animal. Okay, which one? Homo sapiens. Okay. All right. So let's ask ourselves, right? If they're saying they're depressed, they're dysphoric, so forth. What's the origin of that? So from an evolutionary psychiatric perspective, we're going to start with, why does depression exist? Okay. If we see this happen across cultural boundaries, people present in a way that we would describe as depressed. Now, granted, in those other cultures, they would not necessarily use those words. They might call it something else. But if we stick with kind of behavioral presentations and we stay culturally aware, we can see that people get depressed in other cultures, right? There are no cultures where people just never get depressed. Okay. No, it doesn't exist. So then what's going on here? So then we have to ask the question, what is depression? Why does it exist? And you can't stop there, okay? Because even that's not foundational enough for the evolutionary approach. The evolutionary approach says, before we can answer that, we have to ask, why does mood exist at all? I mean, evolution could produce potentially any sort of any sort of animal that you could think of. But because of the requirements of natural selection and adaptation and so forth and so on, not every solution is going to make any sense. Not every possible organism is going to survive. And we're looking at now 3.5 billion years of life on Earth. This process has weeded out a whole lot of stuff that just doesn't happen. The reason why there aren't 50-ton animals that can fly are because of gravity. And let's make you spit out your drink.
I took a sip at the wrong time.
Right. So this we know. So then we need to look at if you look at mood across the board, people have elevated mood. They have they have this sad mood, low mood. There's some reason for why that exists, and it's not an aberration, right? Because you can always say, well, it's just a genetic aberration. Yeah, if that were the case, then you would see 1 in a million, maybe, or maybe even 1 in 100, but you wouldn't see it all over the place. So there's something going on there that we need to look at this from an adaptive point of view. Now, here's where I think the problem is in psychology and psychiatry that doesn't avail itself of these explanations is there's two types of explanations in biological sciences. In ethology, in comparative animal behavior, there is the ultimate and the proximate. So the proximate explanation is an example that Randolph Ness gives in his book that I suggested to you, which is evolutionary. Good Reason for Bad Feelings.
Yeah, great book.
Great book. Yeah.
Great book.
I know you speed read it.
Mhm.
Excuse me. Fighting off a cold. No, but the reason he said he used the example of eyebrows in the book, right? And he said, well, why do we have eyebrows? Well, you can look at the proximate explanation says, well, during development, you have this and that happens to the skull, and these bumps form and all that sort of stuff. And you can trace it down in minute detail if you wanted to, going through the embryology of it and all that. But that's only one piece of the picture. The other piece is the ultimate explanation, which is why do we have them at all? Why did they survive? And all the other possible variations not. So in the example of eyebrows, they originally evolved, most likely, to shield the eyes from the elements, from sun, from rain, or whatnot. And like everything else in nature, if you've got a structure in place and a new way of using it becomes adaptive, then that's what will eventually develop in a species, and that's what happened in humans. So we have eyebrows for that, yes, but we also use them for emotional expression, right? And so that helps us to understand why we have eyebrows, right? But you need to ask this about any sort of behavior that shows up, and that depression falls into that category. So as you've already read the book, then there's no spoilers here, but I can explain that depression exists because it's part of a spectrum of mood, and we have moods because there needs to be a system that says this environment is propitious, has potential for gain, and so I need to crank up my exploratory activity. So that would be elevated mood. When we're in an elevated mood state, we think there's something interesting going on. Let's look around, let's see, let's explore, let's gain whatever we can do. If the environment, however, presents and we perceive it to be not that way, then it is to our advantage to conserve energy and crank it down. One possible reason why this has been overlooked is because it is entirely looking at this from a point of view of a species survival mechanism kind of way. We get caught up in the subjective element of it, which is important, but it doesn't explain anything. Really, it just describes it. It doesn't explain it. It describes it. Big difference. So then the purpose of, we talked about this in the other video about what do I do about depression if I can't get meds?
Yeah.
As we said, what's the point of depression at all? Why do we even have it? So the system, of course, is a biological system, so it's not perfect. So sometimes we're going to get the perception that our environment is not worthy of exploration when that's a misperception. Sometimes we misperceive, we feed bad information into the system, and so we respond with a way that's not as good as it could be. But that doesn't mean that the system is there randomly. It's still always there. You can't escape that. Right? So the other way that it can go wrong is that the system itself is faulty. And so that we see that in extremely severe depression or bipolar. A person who has got their exploration system cranked up to 11 for no real good reason is what we call mania.
Yeah.
Ego, and Jung described this as ego inflation as a extreme of a normal process, right? So ego inflation is what we feel when we get pumped up with that explore, dominate, go out there and, spread your genes or, whatever it is that you need to do. And it makes sense that would be incorporated into our behavior. Now, folks that I've debated this stuff with want to get caught up in the proximate explanations.
Yeah.
And they say, well, but you can't explain how this always emerges. And I'm saying, no, I can't. I don't have to, because it can't exist unless there's an evolutionary explanation for it. And if you keep ignoring that, you're going to miss half of the picture. And every time we see someone who's depressed, we're going to attribute it to all these proximate things, and we might miss the bigger picture, which is that sometimes what we see are just the way Homo sapiens responds to certain situations. Right? So, but trauma, PTSD, it's another good one. PTSD. Everybody has the potential to have PTSD. Is it an illness? Is it a disease? Or is it just a natural response? Well, the way we define that in psychiatry is you can have a stress response, and that's normal, fight or flight or freeze. But if it goes on well beyond the danger period, then we define that as maladaptive and disease, or disorder, right? PTSD is disorder.
Yep.
Okay. So then it's kind of it's embedded in the description of it, but people are not typically thinking that way. But I typically go through this in my folks with trauma because I want them to see that the experience that they're having is not out of nowhere, has nothing to do necessarily with anything they experienced apart from the trauma. It's just that if we didn't have these defensive mechanisms in place, then we probably wouldn't be alive.
Yeah.
Right. So we are descended from the animals that had those defenses because they work. So I just threw like a wall of information out there. I want your thoughts. Help me out.
No. Boy, no, to get it concise, I mean, like, I think that really with having a grounding in evolutionary psychiatry, right? Really, it's really understanding what you could consider diseases and disorders as being purposeful, right? There's meaning in them.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the biggest mistake is that it's a kind of top-down understanding of it instead of a ground up, and there's no meaning in the middle. And from what I've noticed, if you look at the DSM, it's pretty much a checklist. If you got this, or this, you got the disease, right? Instead of looking at it like, well, yeah, I mean, there are certain transpersonal, trans-species aspects of what you might want to consider, might consider mental illness. But in actuality, the purposeful mechanisms that help us survive. And, I really do like Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, because he uses an example that I've thought about many times, is that if you get a cut on your hand, you don't blame the pain for the cut, right? And you don't try to say, okay, the pain, I need to get rid of the pain. You might try to sedate it a little bit, depending on the severity of the pain, but it's mechanistically telling you, hey, avoid this area, right? Because we need to heal. And the same can be said for a lot of what's considered mental illness, in my opinion. And yeah, you talk about PTSD as well. I mean, I recently actually started watching videos and doing a lot of research on shell shock and looking at those soldiers from World War One. And they I think it was shell shock. They called it, before shell shock, I think it was trench. Did they call it trench fever? I'm not sure. Probably not trench fever, but something along those lines. And
battle fatigue is another.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine being put in that situation, that environment, that the psyche, the body, right, mind and body are going to respond in a way that is going to say, well, we're in this for the long run. We're going to perceive the environment in the future as if it's going to be like this forever, right?
Yeah. And so that is there's a defensive mechanism at work there that's concerned about your survival. Yeah.
Now, exactly. Why do you think? I mean, maybe. One, why do you think they?
Hold on, let me time out for a second.
Okay, time out. All right, okay. We're back.
We're back. Okay. Yeah, go on.
No, I was going to ask you. So, one, why do you think the? I mean, maybe not. Why do you think? But where does the field need to go at this point in terms of reevaluating and regrowing that foundation? Is it possible right now? I think that certain practitioners need to take the next step in saying, I'm going to really maybe go against the grain to some extent, and two, reevaluating it from a evolutionary psychological or psychiatric perspective,
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you that what I do for my part is the students that I work with, the residents, they get a huge dose of this from me. But we don't have anything more systematic than that operating. What we really need is a class, I think, for mental health practitioners. Now, I only know about the medical side. I don't know how, like, various psychodynamic institutes incorporate any of this stuff, or grad student programs, But I do think we need to do this because there's this continual disconnect between the psychological sciences and the biological sciences. And there's still resistance to this day to incorporating that. I just got involved, I just finished a paper for the Journal of Analytical Psychology where I'm debating this very issue with a prominent scholar, a Jungian scholar, Christian Rusler. If you're watching this, what's up, man? But we disagree pretty strongly on this issue. He proposed in some of his work that we really don't need to be thinking about biology anymore because we can explain everything with culture. And you can imagine what my response to that is. And so the debate continues, and I'm set to actually have a debate with him next or later this year in Zurich. So that should be interesting. So I don't know what is the problem, honestly. I suspect that the problem is that in the past there have been people who were of a biological bent who wanted to do the same thing that I keep complaining about, was reduce everything to biology. And that's not the answer. Yeah. And I try to lead with that when I'm discussing this. Like, look, I don't want to try to say everything is biology because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I don't know how many times I have to say that, but it's true. Nevertheless, the parts matter. They're there. We have to deal with them, but that's not quite exactly what you were asking, and that's one of the barriers, the roadblocks that we have. As far as like what to do about it, we really should consider incorporating more of this material into our training programs, advanced training programs, and maybe someday get it down to the undergraduate level. But we really just don't talk about much of this. In my own residency, I learned all this stuff on my own. And in neurobiology, the gods came about from my own independent reading. Yeah. Some discussion with Anthony Stevens and all that kind of stuff. And you would think Jung would be a great place to start because he was so biologically oriented to start with. But then later on in his career, he got more interested in metaphysics and all that. And the biological piece of it kind of got forgotten about. But that's not because Jung didn't think it was still valid. It was because he was more interested in even deeper delving and diving into, the origins of archetypal stuff. So, yeah, so there's that. Yeah. And what we're doing in the biological sciences is still very much looking at proximate mechanisms and saying, yeah, well, we've noticed that all these people that are depressed have reduced amounts of serotonin in these various areas of the brain. So that must be the problem. Rather than saying, okay, that's the proximate mechanism behind it, potentially. I mean, it's not even getting into the mind-body problem. But then what about the ultimate explanation, right? So that's why I was really glad to attend the Grand Rounds with Renoff Ness. I got to talk with him after that. And he said he had always thought that Jung would have been a great match for this stuff. He didn't know a whole lot about Jung, but I mentioned him some of my work and everything, and he said, well, it seems like they'd be really on top of that and really want to dive further into it. But in his own experience, it seems like there was quite a few that shied away from that, and want to get kind of caught up in all the cultural and the artistic and all that. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. It's just that there's no reason to disseparate it from the biology. Right. So it could be that it's just there's so much material it's hard to integrate it all, unless you're an uber nerd like me. But I don't think that that's really the case. I think it's just there's fear. There's just some kind of fear that we're gonna, dare we dictate anybody what they could possibly, be? And I was like, that's not the point. The point is to let's look at what we actually are, in fact, in actual fact, being mammals, being Homo sapiens, being, warm-blooded creatures, diurnal, all this stuff. And what does that do? So a whole lot of this debate, I continually return back to, okay, yes, there's all these other influences, but biology starts you here.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just stop at birth. You're born, and then all of a sudden the genome turns off, and everything that you are afterwards is culturally acquired. No, that's not how it works. The genome doesn't ever turn off, right? So there's always going to be responses that are biologically based on our species history and not just our personal history.
Right.
And if you don't think of psychology and psychiatry with that in mind, you're going to assume every response that you see has something to do with their own personal idiosyncratic history, when in fact it may just be a dimension of a natural human response. I want to know about the difference between those two, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it makes all the difference in the world. In some cases, I could be attributing their behavior based on something that happened to them in the past when it may not have anything really to do with that.
Right.
And on the flip side, right, I might assume, if I'm not thinking about this correctly, and I might think, well, you're depressed because that's just a natural thing, and forget about the proximate mechanisms and forget about the life history and the individual, right? I don't want to forget about either. I want to do either of those. That's bad.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I just had something come to mind while you were talking. Like, you have the kind of psychoanalytically driven diggers. Like, we just got to keep digging and find that wound, until you're healed, and all your life issues are caused by that. And then you have maybe the flyers, and it's very superficial. It's like, we just got to treat this with a little bit of medication and, treat the symptom instead of understanding the why. And like, that's what I see as being the major issue. And like, do you think it's, I wonder to what degree if the entirety of psychiatry, developmental psych, the entire field in general really decides to use this as a foundation. I wonder, is the fear based off of, like you said, if we set limitations to the human animal, is that the fear? Is it that we somehow have decided to say that there is purpose in the world, and that somehow negates the more malleable parts of life? I wonder. Yeah.
Well, part of it could be a collective trauma, to get kind of fancy here. The 20th century had some really, really toxic ideas. I think that's an understatement. Yeah. And biology was recruited to defend some of those, like eugenics and all that stuff. And people that aren't familiar with the developments that happened since then still seem to be afraid that somehow biological science is going to revert back to some kind of crazy, eugenics idea. It could be that. It could be that. And because I do run into that every once in a while, people bring up, well, back in the old days, they used to say this to justify sexism and racism and all that. And I'm like, yeah, they did. What's your point? This is not that day. We're beyond that, thankfully. And the idea that biological scientists aren't aware of that is really goofy. Yeah. Of course, they know their history. Maybe a few of them are nutballs, but for the most part, you're not going to get anywhere for promoting ideas like, for example, that, people of African American ancestry in the U.S. score lower on IQ tests than people who are labeled as white. Therefore, there must be blah, 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 blah. And they go bananas with the explanations. And I'm like, hold on, dude. Mm-hmm. Before you try to go down that road with me, let's look at the cultural differences. There is a cultural piece to this that is very powerful and very prominent. And so you can't push the biology button in that case. Yeah. But that obviously makes people very nervous, which I get that, right? That's fair. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. There's still a lot, and I would never make any sort of ridiculous arguments like that. I'm just saying stuff like, Our dream symbols have an origin in our human biology, that our universal constraints and biases on human cognition influence the way we construct dream imagery and symbols. And it doesn't necessarily have to be dreams, just imaginary constructs and meanings and metaphors, like light correlates with, light is a great symbol of truth and knowledge. Why? Because we are diurnal creatures. I've said this 100 times. In a creature that was not diurnal, that would not be a naturally occurring symbol.
Yeah.
But because we are, humans all over the world immediately get that symbolism when you bring it up. It doesn't take a unique poetic genius to come up with that. So looking at that and saying, well, what about culture? Okay, what about it? I didn't say it didn't exist. I didn't say it didn't provide variation. I said that this gives us a predisposition to think and act and feel in these certain ways.
Yeah.
Another example I use all the time is the loneliness issue. All right, so we know feeling lonely hurts. It's not pleasant. It sucks. Why? Well, maybe you weren't hugged enough as a child. Or maybe, mom didn't tell you that she loved you enough. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that we are social animals and we are built that way. You cannot get around it. Period. So that's maybe one of my best examples. I just came up with it off the top of my head of exactly what I'm trying to get at, which is if you lock too hard on one or the other, you're going to miss the big picture. And so if I see someone who is experiencing lots of isolation and they're doing very poorly, I don't need to know what their personal history is necessarily. Their personal history may color their experience and modify it to a degree. But at the end of the day, I know, because I know what species this person is, that they're going to respond in a typically human manner to this. Pain is another great example. If I smash somebody's hand with a hammer, I don't need to explore like what trauma happened to you to make that hurt. Right? You're made to dislike that. And it's okay, because that is how we survive, right? If you enjoyed that, there would be too many of those people around, right? Right? They would get killed, and that would be the end of that lineage, I think I was reading the other day that all human beings on Earth can be traced back to, there's a mitochondrial Eve, and then there's a Y chromosomal Adam that they talk about. I don't think they use Adam and Eve much anymore, but it's the common ancestor of all humanity. And in some cases, you can go back like 200,000 or maybe 150,000 years. But if you think about it, it should give you vertigo to think about that. That one person, that one woman, say, if we go back to the mitochondrial Eve of, I think the latest number I heard was 165,000 years ago. That one woman is the mother of every human being alive. Now, what about all the rest of the humans? There was plenty of them around, but they did not give birth to humanity, right? So that it's easy to lose sight of that, I think, because you look at humans and you look how different we are. Yes, that's true. We have all kinds of different variations, but there's still common features. Yeah. And a whole lot of stuff got weeded out. So that should tell us a lot of information because of constraints. It doesn't tell us exactly how we're going to be. And what, people sometimes come at me with, well, what about adaptation? Yes. Oh, what about spandrels? It's another one. You know what a spandrel is? All right. So spandrel is a side effect, essentially, of an adaptation. So let's see. Feathers. It is the last I heard anyway. It was thought that evolved for temperature regulation first, as a way to regulate temperature more easily. Eventually, though, it developed into the ability to fly because feathers just so happen to lend themselves to, to flight. If you make them bigger and longer and fluffier, Okay, so initially there was a spandrel that the potential for flight wasn't the intent of the initial adaptation. The initial adaptation was designed around temperature regulation. Okay, so then, but of course, nature doesn't ever stop. And so it became useful later on and became an adaptation in and of itself. So things a lot of times start off as side effects and then become incorporated as adaptations. They call that an exaptation. Anyway, that's getting into the weeds, but that's the point. The point is that if we don't think about mental health from an evolutionary point of view, then, like you said before 100 times, right? You don't have any grounding or bedrock. You don't have any point zero. Like, what is the common denominator for everybody? Whether it's social connection, depression, anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Anxiety. Why does anxiety exist? Because if we didn't have it, we'd be dead.
Yeah.
Right? And anxiety follows typical patterns that actually make a lot of evolutionary sense. Women in childbearing years have about double the amount of anxiety that men do. And then after menopause, that levels out. So that's just purely random, I'm sure. No, no. It's because that is more adaptive for females, apparently, who are able to have children. I mean, and maybe this is part of the problem, is that these explanations are never finally proven, right? You have to say, this is potentially adaptive because of A, B, and C. Now let's go look at the data and see if that matches.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's inherently a hermeneutic process. Like, we're always having to discuss, like, is this really the purpose of this adaptation? And so I think maybe that might be part of the fear that we're talking about, is that you could be interpreting it completely wrong, which you could. But the opposite of this was to say that you can't assign any sort of adaptive purpose to anything is ludicrous, right? That doesn't make sense. And the eyebrows are just there just for randomness, for the lulls, etc. Right? Because God said so, right?
Right.
And even that doesn't fly. Well, why the hell did God say so?
Yeah. Do you think that there's the cultural equivalent to, like, these spandrels, right? I mean, like, and this is kind of like also at the core, I would say, of different schools of thought when it comes to we are just products of culture, which is, well, from an evolutionary perspective, that means culture has its direct creation, right? Culture is created via biological mechanisms.
Yeah, right. That's the other problem. Like,
right.
Okay,
so,
if we're products of culture, where the hell does culture come from?
Exactly. Right. And then the cultural differences could be, in a sense, I mean, there are cultural differences, but they are differences that are based off of certain adaptations that certain populations had to go through. And the spandrels there, the differences there, right, are still indicative of certain adaptations that are biologically related to biology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so what you're talking about is gene culture coevolution. So gene culture coevolution is the phenomenon that genomes, they don't care where the information comes from. They adapt, they develop, and so forth, regardless. So if a species has a particular behavior that's reliable enough that it's always in the environment now, then we will develop adaptations that are dependent on that environmental thing being there. So in other words, a simpler way to explain this would be fish. Okay, so fish expect water.
Yep.
So a lot of their adaptations are involved in various swimming behaviors, swimming defenses against predators, against potential cannibals. There's all that kind of stuff that goes on. And they don't need to learn this stuff necessarily. Now, there's a gray area here in that that innate and learning they're not opposites of each other, because learning is facilitated by the genome. right? And the genome will automatically, a lot of times, will use learning to achieve its ends. Okay, so the fish, because fish live in water, right? They just come to expect the water to be there. Well, what about humans? What kind of water do we live in? We live in a social environment. Those that don't die. So there's no need for us to have parts of the genome that involve what if there is no culture? So then they're all oriented towards culture. So infants will track eyes. They listen to sounds and in the human voice range. They acquire language without even trying. Why? Because those are our adaptations. And the genome has been doing this for long enough that that it can rely and easily rely on the fact that there's going to be people around it talking, and that they'll be able to pick up a language. So, but the problem is, people look at that and they say, oh, if there's no one talking, they can't learn a language. Therefore, it's not innate. You see how that oversimplifies the problem?
Yeah.
Significantly. Because the genome is expecting a language and it grabs it up without even really having to work that hard. I mean, you've tried to learn a language later in life. It's a lot hard. As an adult, it's tough, right? It's a lot of work. Unless you go immerse yourself in it, and then those childhood mechanisms, it's like they kick in, and you'll pick it up without really having to study as much. You'll just start to pick it up if you pay attention, you know. But there's clearly a language acquisition period at which the genome says this is the time frame you need to start learning. But when was that learned? It wasn't. You weren't born with the need for someone to come along and say, now, this is when you need to learn this language, little Jimmy. No, they just do it. They just do it. So it's not that there isn't any learning in innate processes, in genetic processes. In fact, most of the time there is learning, but it's not just random learning of anything, or no matter how absurd or bizarre or weird.
Yeah.
No, it's specific stuff that I know I'm going to need, right? How do I know that? It's in the genome. Yeah. It's everyone who didn't have that is no longer amongst the living. All right. So in a sense, it's kind of like ancestral memory, but we could get off on a different stuff.
Oh yeah. Oh, I love that stuff.
That's another one. That's another one. So what you're saying then, you're talking about is gene culture coevolution. Okay. So let's say you have a group of people. They separate off from the mass and go do something else and live in a different environment for a long time. They will slowly adapt to that environment as well. Okay, so a good example is skin color. And we know that this only takes several thousand years for a population to be isolated in a region of low light for this to evolve, right? The very first human beings were not light-skinned. Obviously, they had dark skin because they were African. And Homo sapiens were Africans for the first 140,000 years of our existence on this planet. And prior to that, we were proto-humans. So Africa is the cradle of humanity. But once those Homo sapiens migrated out into other areas, then the culture, which involved moving to another area, affected the genome. So the gene and the culture feed into each other. It's this process of conversing with each other. Because those that didn't have the lighter skin didn't do as well in in the dry, cold climates. Okay, there's also adaptations to blood pressure and salt retention that are related to this too, which is why there are some ethnicity concerns about certain illnesses like hypertension, cystic fibrosis, and sickle cell anemia. All this kind of stuff is related to our culture. So sickle cell is another great example. So you see sickle cell trait at much higher rates of percentage of existence in populations that have a traditional history of yam farming.
Yeah.
What? Right now, I think I've explained how this works to you before, but for our three, fans out there, I'll explain it again. Hey, what I'm talking to you guys. It's the fact that yam farming requires static water, which is a great place for mosquitoes to grow. And so what happens then? Well, you get higher rates of malaria transmission, which kills people. So humans that have been in that for generations evolved, and they developed a higher prevalence of sickle cell trait. Why? Because the sickle cell trait, now not the disease, but the trait is protective against malaria infection. If you get it, the malaria organisms will invade blood cells. If you have the sickle cell trait, though, it collapses on the organism and kills it. So it's a natural defense against malaria. Unfortunately, if you get both traits from one from each parent, you get sickle cell disease, which is not, which is a big problem. It causes lots of health problems. But nature doesn't give a crap about that. Okay, nature cares about whether or not it survives 51% of the time, and if it does, you're good to go. So, circling back to our initial concern about depression, Ness gives a great example of fever.
Yeah.
And he says, let's look at fever as an analogy to mental illness. If I get an infection, one of the first things that our immune system does is says, boom, fever. Why? Because in a lot of cases, it can help slow down a bacterial or viral infection, higher temperature. Not always, though. Sometimes you get a fever and you don't need it. It's just there because 51% of the time it was good enough to maybe get you through, to muddle through. But what about the other 49% of the time? You're just SOL. You got a fever and you feel miserable for no good reason. So then that's when we come in and we say there's a biological or evolutionary rationale and meaning behind this response, but it's clumsy. It's not necessary. It's overkill. It's whatever. And so our job then is to help a person get through that while minimizing the unnecessary responses and help put meaning to the necessary piece of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think psychologically or subjectively, we would say, let's look at the meaning behind this anxiety or this depression. What's going on here? Mm-hmm. And a lot of our work is involved in what are you perceiving the world to be really like? So if I have runaway anxiety, for example, it could partially be because my narrative, my personal narrative, is one of an incredibly dangerous world where I'm constantly being judged or I'm constantly, in danger of harm.
Yeah.
And that perception could be off. And so if I alter the perception, the anxiety changes because the anxiety itself is actually rational.
Yeah.
Right. It's the problem is you're feeding it in garbage information. Right. So garbage in, garbage out. Right.
Yeah.
If I don't feed it the correct information, then I get a response that is maladaptive.
Yeah. And if you're told that it's somehow bad, right, or wrong, or it's an imposter. I know we've talked about this so much, but you're talking and it's just like, yeah, I mean, if hopefully a culture provides a generative way for those issues to be expressed and for an evolutionarily adaptive way for those issues to be expressed, because we're all going to experience them to some degree throughout our lives, whether it's us or other people. And I mean, I see this now, and I'm sure you see it every day also, is that you have a lot of people come in who have these perceptions about their depression, about their anxiety, about their quote unquote mental illness. And they've been told all this, and it's just making it that much worse. It's not getting to the foundation of the issue. It's just, that kind of throwing meds and big pharma, throwing meds out and saying, here, if we cure the symptom or we cure the symptom, you're cured type thing.
Mm-hmm. It's just giving painkiller to someone who has appendicitis.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like trying to treat a fever without knowing what's causing the fever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you might just be covering up an important symptom.
Yeah.
That we need to know something about. And in the case of fever, you rule out those things.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, well, then this is just a fever that we can give medicine for because you don't really need this. It's our natural biological defenses kicking in when they don't really need to.
Yeah.
That's because nature is not perfect. Our human bodies are not perfect. That said, they're not idiots either. Like there is a lot of wisdom in the symptoms that we often have. Yeah. So that's where the art comes in, is figuring out that.
Yeah.
If you have excessive anxiety because you have this perfectionism complex that's cranked up to 11, then yeah, you need to tone that stuff down. That if that you're anxious because you feel like all of these bad things are happening that you can't control, then you've got runaway anxiety that's not functional at all.
Mm.
But to have no anxiety at all, good luck with that, right? That's
Yeah.
right. You're not going to find anybody that maybe, I don't know, fighter pilots or something, but
Right.
they don't come to therapy, right? They're good. They don't need nobody, right? They're fine. They've got nerves of steel. That's why they do what they do. Like test pilots, right? Those guys, astronauts. No, but we don't get those guys, right? We get people with anxiety. So, yeah, that's a good example. A good example of how not understanding the evolutionary origin of it can it just never get at the root of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's take another great example. We'll wrap up with this: drugs. Okay. Drugs are one of the areas where I think this can really, really help a lot, because our current understanding of drugs are you take a drug because it's addictive. Okay, well, why is it addictive? Because it hits the pleasure centers in the brain. All right, that's the explanation you hear. Well, what the hell does that mean? Why are there pleasure centers in the brain? What are they there for? And like, why this particular drug? Why does cocaine do what it does? Why does heroin do what it does?
Yeah.
All right, we run into these folks all the time. They're addicted to these drugs. So if we don't understand the evolution behind this, though, none of it makes much sense. Like, you just need to stop doing that. Is it? Just say no, right? They made a whole campaign over that. How effective was that? So yeah, the whole war on drugs, right? It's complete. Don't get me started. Anyway, I think that you can really understand a ton of, not all, but most addictive substances as connected to our social networking system. Because we're social animals and we can care very much what other people think about us, we don't learn to be that way. Okay, we are that way because we evolved to be that way. And no matter how many times people want to get on Facebook and talk about how much they don't care about what anybody thinks, and they're going to go do their own thing and blah, 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 they're full of crap, right? We've gone down that road. It's just, they're just proving the point that I'm making, which is that, yeah, you do care, sir. And don't try to convince me otherwise.
Right.
But that's not bad. That's not bad. We need that, right? If everybody didn't give a rat's butt about anybody, then we'd have total chaos and the whole society would collapse.
Yeah.
So there is a biological basis for that, because it works obviously really well. There's 7 billion of us crawling around on this planet. But what is so that's the ultimate mechanism. Now let's look, what's the proximate mechanism? I keep talking about forgetting about the ultimate in exchange for the proximate, but don't make the other mistake, right? Yeah. So yeah, we're socially motivated, and that's why we are that way. Well, what's the proximate mechanism? The opiate system. The opiate system is behind care, social attachment, feelings of rejection, and all that. Now, isn't it interesting that that is using the opiate system? Now, there's some other players in here like oxytocin and vasopressin that got added on later in evolutionary terms, but the basis of it is the opiate system. Okay, also the pain regulation system. I'm sure that's complete random coincidence. No, it's because that evolved from our pain regulation mechanisms. So pain is important to manage, because pain means there's something bad going on and we need to avoid it. Okay. And we've talked about this before in other videos. Evolution came along and said, I need a system that'll help me motivate social behavior, right? I'm personifying evolution here, but just stick with me. What's going to do that? Well, I've already got this system over here that says, avoid this painful thing. Okay, I'll use that. All right, so now with my advanced frontal lobe here, as it continues to grow throughout evolution, I'll be able to perceive situations that are potentially socially dangerous for me. Because I've invested so much of my biological energy and resources into the brain and social behavior, I better monitor that closely. So very early in development, we start really paying close attention to this stuff. We really start caring about what our parents and everybody else thinks. We don't learn to do this. We just do it. So then that latches on to the opiate system and says, this situation is potentially dangerous and fraught with rejection, which could leave me isolated and I could die. All this is unconscious. So it's going to hurt, and I'm going to avoid it as best I can. Boom, loneliness, right? And we know loneliness can be traced to the opiate system, along with a huge number of addictive substances, right? Not just heroin, but alcohol, a ton of stuff goes along this pathway. Also, you can link gambling addictions and a bunch of other types of addictions to the same system. So when a person is feeling this kind of pervasive sense of unease at their social situation because of isolation, and I have no idea how to deal with this because I haven't been taught evolutionary psychiatry because I'm an idiot, say, right? Then what am I going to do? Well, when I take this pill, that pain goes away.
Yeah.
I'm not physically damaged. It's the social pain that I'm alleviating with the pill, but it runs along the same track. It uses the same neurotransmitters. So here you can see evolution and proximate and ultimate mechanisms come together in an explanation of the problem that helps us to see what's really going on. Mm-hmm. And if all you do is say, well, when I take this pill, it tickles the pleasure center. Yeah. That's a crappy explanation. It doesn't tell you anything useful. It doesn't connect to our evolutionary history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a great description.
Yeah.
That was a really good description.
And I see this every day. Absolutely every day. I have folks that come in, they've got all these drugs in their system, and it starts with the social isolation. Yeah. Which is rampant in our Western world. Yeah. And it's not just me saying that. That's a bunch of scholars now really worried about what they call the loneliness epidemic. And I think that the continual rise in drug use is not just due to the fact that people are making new and creative ways to fry your brain. They are, but it wouldn't work. It wouldn't sell if there wasn't a deep need for this stuff. And it's a social need. Yeah. It's a social need. And these drugs would not work on other species necessarily.
Right. These drugs wouldn't, again, they wouldn't exist if there wasn't a propensity for the culture to continue to propagate or to continue to propagate a lack of fulfillment, right? For those that are participating in it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like these ideas around what we create and what we should be aren't necessarily what we need. Yeah. I think that's why, and I bring up a lot of good points because I think that's why the people that you come across clinically, you look across with them and you have to look at the entire context of their lives in regards to everything that we discussed, and I think it is unfortunate that
I was just going to say, part of it is just the fact that you happen to be a human being.
Yeah.
And that human beings react in this particular way.
Yeah.
Species normal. Okay. And we're not going to be able to enculturate that out of the genome. And I don't think we should want to, because that would be extremely dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
All right. So we can't, we just want to not play with fire there.
Right.
But so cannabis products, another one that tickles that system. It's the only advantage of that is that it's less addictive. But of course, the problem is that people put all kinds of other crap in there, and then they end up gorked out of their mind, and they're in my side of the house again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But not enough people are asking is, why is the desire for this stuff so high? Why is there so many people seeking these things out? You know, and if you don't have evolution as your guide here, you got nothing. Well, we teach them to crave drugs. I don't know how they would explain this. I don't know. It would just not land. It would not make sense.
No, it doesn't. I mean, you can't explain depression rates going up just randomly. Like, oh yeah, depression rates are going up. Well, why? Oh, well, actually, yeah, we don't know. We don't know. It's like, well, maybe the issue is that the issue isn't the people that are having the depression, right? The issue is that we're creating more and more unsatisfactory ways of living, to a certain extent.
Yeah. Now that just triggered a memory that I'm going to have to let's end with this. This will be the question, because I was able to pull out of this debate that I was about to get into with somebody online. And if you're out there listening to this, just don't do this. It's a waste of time. But there was this meme, right, that was circulating, and it said, it was a therapist saying that what most of their patients really just need is more money. Yeah, I know. And I'm looking at it like
no.
But I think that the meaning behind it, right, if I'm trying to understand why somebody would post something like that, is because they're trying to advocate for social change, and they're trying to advocate for, maybe workers' rights, or not so much income disparity. Oh, okay, I get that. That's cool.
Yeah.
But to say that that's the real cause for everyone's problems, oh, okay, so if you just spread a bunch of money around, everybody's going to be happy all of a sudden? You know better than that. I know better than that. This person should have known better than that. How many people have you had that had all kinds of money coming out their ears and they're utterly miserable? Yeah. Plenty. And there's people that have nothing hardly, and they're fine. They're cool.
Happy as a clam.
Like Zen masters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just naturally that way. So what's the difference there? So it's just the simple answer to this is yes. Having a great deal of need and deprivation will certainly lead you to feeling depressed and anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And having enough money to pay the bills and not starve to death will go a long way to making you feel better. But that's the diminishing return. More money doesn't help anything beyond that, right? And maybe they weren't wanting to go down that road, but I saw that and I thought all the people that are looking at this are going to just zero in on that and think, oh, it all reduces to that.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
Stop that.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir there.
I know.
I watched a video. Yeah, I completely agree. I watched a video of a very prominent online psychologist say that the reason why you're unhappy and the reason why you're unhappy at work is because you haven't diversified your income enough. So you haven't worked enough, as if work will set you free, right? And I'm like, no, okay, I'm done.
Work will set you free?
Yeah. That's pretty much what he was saying. Yeah. Man.
What they put on Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Scary.
He's obsessed with that too. So yeah.
So no. Human beings survived for countless ages without boatloads of cash. But I think the kernel of the idea that in there that is salvageable is that there's a lot of social stuff that is making us miserable. It's not just money, though. It's such a typical response. More money is the answer to everything. No, we need more connection. We need more meaning. Right. We need more substance. We need more belonging. We need more affiliation. We need more people feeling like they have autonomy, affiliation, connection, giving, but not too much, right? We went through that with Beowulf, right? You find that balance.
Yeah.
Where a mutual give and take lifts both. All that stuff, that will help you feel better, not just cash.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how we're going to end it. Nice. I love it. Thank you, Dr. G. I'll see you later.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.